Morning. I am Emily Short. I am a consultant in interactive narrative. So how are we telling stories that are aligned with what we're delivering in our game? And up until a few months ago, I was creative director at Fail Better Games, which is a British indie narrative-focused game company. So what I will be talking about today is challenges around building interactive stories that are responding to the circumstances of your gameplay as tightly as possible, and in particular, how do we design and scope for all of the elements that we need to present to the player when we have content that might be procedurally changed somewhat during runtime. Oh, whoa.
So that we can see more of you.
That's fine, but very disconcerting. Okay, so this is a very much less sort of technically specific talk than the previous one, although I'm happy to go into technical details if we want to. But this is mostly around sort of what are the design processes that we bring into play when thinking about these problems. We've got a non-linear story to tell. We've got lots of elements that perhaps are being produced by writers and other content creators. We need to decide in-game when and how to serve those elements. And then I'm going to be talking about a specific project, the last piece of major content that I released at Fail Better, that runs through how we approach that in that particular case, because I felt that that worked out fairly well. But hopefully that will leave us with some sort of general things that we can take away and apply across games at many different scales, because I also have worked in sort of indie spaces, in mobile spaces, in AAA spaces, and some of the challenges that arise with assembling a good narrative out of procedural elements are continuous across all of those places, although the sort of production pipeline challenges get bigger and bigger sort of the further you go towards the AAA space. All right, so one of the things that I'm sort of constantly bringing in as a way of thinking about this problem in general is the concept of the storylet. And this is a very sort of high-level term. In different companies, you might have this same idea, but call it something else. Some people talk about nodes. Some people talk about sort of content chunks. But essentially, this is a way of thinking about any piece of story content. So that might be lines of dialogue. It might be written narration. It might be a scene that's sort of scheduled to play, whether that's a cut scene or an interactive scene at a particular point in the narrative. Any of those kinds of things could be a storylet. And we're looking at those as being triggered by something going on in the world state of the game. So that might be, has the player intentionally triggered this? Have they paid some sort of cost to access this bit of content? Has their skills reached a certain level? Have they fulfilled other kind of narrative prerequisites? In a more systemic game, have they done other things through gameplay that change the world state to the point where we're activating this bit of narrative? So then we're going to play that piece of content, whatever it is, and then we're going to apply the effects of that content on the world state again. So maybe in that course of that content, we're inviting the player to make some sort of choice. Maybe we're inviting them to pick some dialogue to respond with. Maybe they're spending some in-game resources, but we're applying those effects again back to the world and moving on with our story. So this is generic enough that, like, that basic idea applies across all sorts of different games in many different contexts. Similar sorts of approaches are used with delivering dialogue in Left 4 Dead. We've got situations where the system is looking at where are we in our sort of fighting situation, in the pacing of the game, what is going on right now, and what barks and reactions should we be serving in response to that. We see it in Firewatch. Characters are wandering around a map, or the player's wandering around a map, looking at items, and we have to have sort of systemically served responses to what are we looking at, where are we in the story so far, where has our relationship with the main character that we're talking to progressed to, what are we going to pick for her to say. 4X games, if you've got sort of narrative moments that come up in response to what you've done so far in the gameplay, where your systems are, how many people are killed off, what battles you're in, all of those kinds of things similarly can be triggering story content. So this is applicable across many types of games. But the big sort of heinous thing that always happens whenever you're trying to talk this through at the beginning of a project production is just, how are we going to tell how many of these content elements we need? Like, however we've defined them and however complex they are, we need to have some sort of idea of like, how many of these things are we building? How many writers are we hiring? What kind of VO and localization commitments are we making if we're doing that? And so it feels much more frightening, generally, to producers especially, than a nice linear narrative, right? They're used to, we're going to approach a game narrative as we've got these chunks, we've got a certain number of scenes in our sort of regularly scheduled progress that we're going to need to deliver. They can understand how to scope and deliver that, but it gets much scarier when you're saying, I've got this big bag of different bits of content, and it's going to correspond somehow to the game state. I don't exactly know like how much of this we're going to need, et cetera. And that gets very disturbing. And when you're sort of first making systems like this, often you wind up with a sort of initial naive approach which says, okay, we've got these different elements of game state that we want to speak to somehow. And so I'm just going to say I need 1, 5, however many storylet chunks of content to correspond to each of these important elements of game state, and that's a multiplier, and so here's my list. I've got 1 chunk of content for every state we can get into. And this is in fact sort of how I also thought about things very early on. This is sort of a horrendous bit of spreadsheet from something that I worked on in 2010 when I was sort of first building this out. And what I had was, I've got these elements of content that are going to be triggered by this stat that's going up, and I've got to just 1 storylet corresponding to kind of each general stage that we can be at in that development. So as I say, this kind of approach is hard to scope. It leads to longer iteration because partway through production, you realize that there are all kinds of ways that world state can be influencing, multiple pieces of world state can be influencing what storylets you want to be reaching for. So you go through a lot of kind of iteration and head scratching at that point. That iteration process can take a really long time, which is, again, alarming to production and winds up sort of cramping how much time you have for polish and QA. And then the other challenge about that is it doesn't actually necessarily produce the best narratives either, because your process of designing and thinking about how to approach this has not really invited you to question what are the major sort of narrative themes that I'm even trying to get to here, right? I might have a game state that is tracking all sorts of different things, from resources that are available to the player, relationships they have with other characters, sort of choices that they've made ideologically. Which of those things am I actually telling a story about? Even if the story that I'm telling is a very responsive and procedural one, am I sure that I'm really connecting the beats of that to the right things in whatever underlying system I'm working with? So how can we approach this better? How can we think better about these kinds of problems? How do we understand the total state space of our game rather than a bunch of individual stats? Identify which of those states are going to matter from a narrative perspective, and make sure that we're prioritizing the things that the player needs to act upon. So sometimes this is more important in some games than in others. So in some games, we are relying on other systems or UI to alert the player to things that they particularly need to react to. However, in some games, especially ones where most of the game actually consists of this kind of content, we need to particularly make sure anytime the player is in an urgent situation, we're selecting storylets for them, we're selecting content for them that is going to make them alert to, hey, this is a big deal, you should be paying attention to this. So we need to think about all of these things when we're trying to design our storylets for particular story space. So a couple of different strategies that I've sort of learned over the years or picked up from other people who are doing similar projects around how to kind of pull our understanding of that state space together in order to speak to it in a useful way. So possibly sort of the simplest of these is what stats can we put in opposition to one another, and what can we say in an interesting way about sort of the comparison of this approach versus that one. And the basic version of this is that kind of very simple, how many in Fable, how many good things have you done versus how many bad things. It can be very kind of simplistic and cut and dried, but you don't necessarily have to say, like, we're committing to just a kind of good and bad stat pairing. You can say of any of the stats in our game, where is it interesting for us to compare the player's commitment to one of those stats over the player's commitment to another stat, and what can we do with that that's interesting and useful? How have they distributed fixed resources that they have access to? So say the player has 3 important items that they can hand out. They've got 3 flowers to give to their dates, and how do they distribute them among the characters that they might have interacted with? If they've got sort of something that they can optionally spend a certain amount of time on. They've spent time on 1, 2, 3, or all 4 sets of side quests. Where have they put that kind of energy? And what can we conclude around what decisions they're making within the story's themes? Along the same lines, if you've got sort of stats that are contributing to the same total, these again, we're talking about things that come up in other game systems all the time. So that's not really sort of a completely novel approach. So something that in inventory, for instance, in an equipment system, we're saying, do you have enough equipment of a certain type to get your stats, your overall defense stats, your overall attack stats to a particular place? But we can think that way about narrative as well. So if we've got a game about loneliness, how many of the sort of stats that you've built with various friends, how many friendships have you built? And are you getting to a point where your overall level of loneliness and disconnection has reached a certain point? And then the concept of clocks, racing clocks. So the term clocks comes out of Blades in the Dark, a tabletop RPG system, where the game master uses clocks that are visible to the player as a stat that says, how many steps have you gone down the road towards something major happening? Are you so wounded that you're going to get in trouble? Are you causing so much trouble with your enemies that they're going to attack you? And this, again, obviously is a very sort of useful thing to be using in a game narrative to sort of pull off, like, okay, you've exasperated this enemy to a certain point. But when we're thinking about that and planning our storylet space, we really also want to be thinking about, all right, how many of these do we have active in our game currently? How are they going to interact with each other? And when one of the clocks fires first, does that affect the other one? When they're both close to firing, is that creating a situation that we need to speak to specifically? So these might be things like, are we going to make it to land before the leaky raft sinks? Are we going to find the antidote before the poison takes effect? Are we going to assemble a big enough team from the multiple characters that we're making friends with in order to start our heist? And what happens when we're sort of close to the boundaries on multiple things? Okay, so this is all very sort of broad and general, and I'm going to come to a much more specific example in a second. But it speaks to a sort of general approach in that very early sort of ideation and scoping stage, before you're even really building out content at all, very early stage of identifying, like, what are the relevant stat groupings? What am I thinking about in terms of oppositions between them, connections where multiple stats are contributing to the same kind of narrative advancement, and then areas where I need to be aware of the different ways that different temporal arcs could be advancing in the game. So that point of clocks, like, how close are we to this piece ending? How close are we to that piece ending? Does it matter if those happen in different orders? And do I need to assign storylets to speak to sort of special combinations of that? And then as you're thinking about all of those sorts of elements, you want to verify that any major oppositions and stats that you're looking at, any of these sort of, oh yes, I've identified these groupings. I've identified that I'm going to be looking at overall friendship. I've identified that I'm going to look at overall ideological balance. Are those actually aligned with the kind of story I want to tell and what's interesting about this particular narrative? All right, so I promised specificity, getting down to a particular example here. So at Failbetter, one of the things that I worked on was their long-running browser game, Fallen London. This has been running, in fact, since 2010, and it is a mostly text-based game with maps where you can kind of move around spaces in this game world. It's based on a kind of Lovecraftian version of Victorian London. So Victorian London has been taken underground. There are all sorts of strange, disturbing creatures living down there. But the player moves around this space, finds elements that they want to interact with, text stories with images, and decides, what do I want to do here of the choices that are available to me, and it updates stats. So it's basically, it is a game that is made purely out of storylet content and not very much of any other kind of system. So it's a great kind of proving ground for this kind of material. And again, relying very heavily on the storylet structure, what that looks like in this case, we're picking sort of specific pieces of story that we want to interact with from our screen of options. We can actually look at, of the stories that are available to us at a given moment, what requirements are attached to that particular story even being available. So it's really exposing that procedurality to the player at a very overt way. And then when we select a particular storylet to interact with, we have choices within that piece of content, which are themselves locked or unlocked depending on where the player is. So a few years ago, when I first came on working there, we started a plot line which was based on the player getting involved in building a railroad to the west of London, which in this particular geography is roughly the direction of hell. And we wanted to build this in a way that the player could create a sort of long-term difference in the world, because one of the things that we heard from the player base was, we really love the fact that in this game we can advance our own character, we can build all sorts of stats and qualities and sort of personal history for that character, but our character, because it is a browser-based game, because there are certain kind of content constraints on what we can even put into it, we're not really able to change the geography and the experience of the game very much, and we would really love some more elements where the player is having influence on the game geography. So we said, okay, we're going to build a big plot line where you can actually do this. You can work with the kind of union leader of the people who build out the railway tracks. You can plan your movement towards the various stations that you're going to put in place. Those are going to open out elements that you can play in the game world. And as you're doing that, you can make choices about which sort of union ideology you want to commit to. So sort of speaking to those stats, and there are sort of conflicting groups, some people who have a more sort of negative approach to authority versus those who are more cooperative and so on. And we really went to town in terms of letting the player make lots of choices about what they wanted specifically in this storyline. Giving them the opportunity to commit to ideologies, commit to particular characters that they were going to put in charge of the city that they were building at the end of the railway, where they were actually going to locate that city, lots and lots of stuff. And I will admit up front that part of the reason that we felt so free to let the player do as much as they wanted was that this was meant to be an end game piece of content where we thought, you'll make up all this stuff, you'll make all of these commitments as a character, you'll do whatever you want to out here, and then we'll just give you a light epilogue, maybe just a few little bits. But mainly, it's kind of up to the player's imagination, the meaning of all of those many choices that they've made. And we weren't really thinking, oh, we're committed to have to actually deliver on telling the player what that city is like after they've built all of the things that they put out there. Well, surprise, a few years later on, A, our players wanted more content, B, they really wanted more content specifically about the result of all the choices that they'd made. And so here we were, stuck with like a world state that I would never, never commit to as the beginning of a game under any other circumstances, that we had to somehow account for. How are these choices that you made, possibly several years ago, playing out in this city? How are we producing enough coverage for this? And our usual sort of content models around what we're doing at sort of Fallen London content tend to focus on much simpler, more linear chunks of narrative, even within the sort of broadly procedural space that it's in. So that left us with a real design challenge. Like, how are we coping with that? How are we making some content that is going to account for all of these different choices, tell you little stories about what is happening in your city that reflect decisions like, I decided to put this city in a place where there are lots of squid creatures living, or I decided to put this city in a place that is right near hell and therefore there are lots of devils running around, or I decided to put this city in a place where there is a nearby church established, and the church, by the way, also has a religion that is the result of my choices. So all of these sorts of elements that we somehow had to be able to speak to and deal with, and this was a real sort of invitation to try out all of the sort of systemic approaches that we'd worked on so far. So, taking the sort of methods of slicing up our stats that we had before, like how do we reduce all of these numerous options in the first place to a set that we can narratively work with? So the first piece was we had these 3 different factions in railway building that the player could have committed to. So that's not your sort of typical dual stat opposition, it's more of a 3-way stat opposition. Which of these things have you supported, how much? And part of the challenge here was that the player could optionally have put in different amounts of energy into supporting any factions at all, so we didn't even know what was the total number of sort of stats that they might have distributed across all elements. We just knew that they wouldn't necessarily have some distribution of this through these 3 systems. So we approached this as a ternary plot. If you've seen sort of ternary plots before, often they're used to sort of describe states of matter, like if you've got a certain amount of clay in your soil, what type of soil does that make it versus what percentage of your soil is sand, and kind of phase states like that. So they're a good way of thinking about if we've got 3 numbers that are not independent from each other, we're trying to look at what is our overall percentage of assignment to a particular stat type. And we use that to plot out what are our commitments to these different factions in the railway that the player might be connected to. Looking at that, though, we didn't just want to say, you know, oh, you're mostly committed to this, you're mostly committed to that. We wanted to think of what is narratively meaningful here. Like, of the places where you could have put your stats, which of these actually have something that we could narratively say about where you wound up? So for instance, you know, if you are really at one extreme, like you really spent all of your faction support on one particular faction, that's meaningful because that shows a real commitment to that particular faction and nobody else. If you're in the exact center, that's also narratively meaningful because you've made the decision not to accommodate any one faction particularly much. If you're in a majority in one place or another, that might be meaningful as well. So we wanted to acknowledge kind of all of these different ways that the player could have intent arising from the assignment of their stats, but at the same time not have to tie our storylets to very specific stat choices that might be sort of too confining to actually be able to speak to. So we had this sort of concept of like, where are the narratively meaningful zones in what the player might have done? And then so as an example, you know, if they have never done any work with the prehistoricist faction, which is the faction that wants to sort of rebuild ancient-style animals to roam the earth, but they've spent most of their time with 2 other factions, the emancipationists or liberationists, they could have their stats at a distribution of 45, 55, and 0, and that would actually put them in the overlap where they could mean a couple of different things by that, right? It might mean that they were really sort of particularly committed to the emancipationist group because we've got a slight majority there. It might mean that they're more interested in kind of the mix of both and they just kind of happen to land somewhere in the middle. But what we're doing here is we're letting the player choose. In the game, we actually present them with a moment of option of which of these things do you think your ideology in your city really comes out to? And then they select a specific kind of alignment for the city that lets us kind of narrow down a lot of that stat-based information. And we used that same technique in a couple of different areas where we had a lot of potential causality available in the world state, but we wanted to figure out, like, what did the player intend or what does the player most want out of this? So another thing that we asked them about was, Given sort of various things about your player's history, the place where you've located your city, the type of magic that you used to even found that city in the first place, what kind of architectural style does it have? So they're able to kind of pick some elements like that. And that gave us a much more kind of coherent grounding set of stats to even work with in building this out. So then we identified kind of what is our initial scope based on that refined set of stats. One was, we've got a bunch of default storylets that we know we need to have happen in any kind of story that we're playing in this world, things that are going to speak to kind of religion, gathering supplies and food in this place, finding a house, sort of a bunch of these elements where no matter where you've put your city, no matter what you've done, there's going to be some element of that to the story that we want to tell. But then also looking at kind of our two major kinds of clocks that are operating in this environment. Personal menace, so like you could be injured, you could be particularly frightened, and those things are kind of dangers that can apply to the character personally. You've also got menaces that are applying to the city as a whole. So is there civic unrest in the city? Is there a loss of population based on things that are going on there? So we kind of planned around how are we dealing with those clocks, and some storylets that are going to be needed to apply to cases where we're actually high on multiple clocks at once. So suppose we're in a situation where we've lost a lot of the population, but the remaining population is quite angry and upset. That's a situation that actually needs to play and read differently from a situation where we have civic unrest and there's a lot of population around still to kind of express that unhappiness. And then sort of one for each approach of we want some storylets that speak to what location have you founded your city in, what leader have you installed, what ideological profile have you picked, kind of based on the previous refinement of elements. And we did a fair amount within that sort of storylets tied to particular stats where triggering the storylet, making the storylet available in the first place, was dependent on one set of stats, but the actual content of that storylet varied depending on a second stat. So, for instance, let me skip ahead here a moment. If we have a situation where there's a disturbing event that can happen in your city based on sort of the overall menace state of the city getting to a certain point, so your clock has reached a certain point, then within that, we have some specific choices and elements that are based on what location you're in or what sort of choices you've made. Sorry, I can't read my own. There you go. What sort of choices you've made in setting up the railway. And that meant that if the player changed any of the stats involved, their experience of that storylet would change, even though the sort of activation was still happening on the same basis. So one of the really nice things about sort of having thought about the system in this way is that it actually turns the creative process into one in which, as a writer, you've got lots of writing prompts provided to you by the system, because you've committed to, oh, I want to write about how the leader I have chosen is interacting with the sort of city that we're in, and I've decided in advance that the sort of details of that are going to depend on what location we're in. And so I've got this writing prompt of thinking, I know this character in this location, what are they going to be doing together, and being able to kind of write to that. And at the same time, because we had some division of storylets appearing associated with specific subsets of the stat space, so certain storylets would only appear if you were in a particular location, that was less it felt less templated, it felt less binding than if we had to write one default template that was able to speak to all of those situations, all of the possible states that the game could be in. The other thing that we did, and this is at the level of sort of text variations possible because we're in a text game, was to have a bunch of text variables that contained really specific details that we might want to use in writing the storylet. So this is a text-specific approach, but it's something that if you wanted to apply this to a more graphical game or a different style of game, you could use a similar approach in terms of like what graphics am I overlaying, what elements am I swapping in here. But so we had things like specifically, what is the name of a street in this city? What is a building that is visible on the horizon of this city? Elements like this, where there are things where in the course of writing a description, you're likely to want to refer to it, and being able to pull in some variable that has been set separately is adding that extra level of precision to the storylet that you're delivering. So at this point, you could have a piece of text that's been triggered by one stat, it's been varied by a second stat, and you're pulling in sort of further text variations based on maybe a third stat, even though you haven't necessarily sort of put in the labor associated with actually writing that sort of three-way combinatorial combination. So you get all of these sort of small text tweaks. All right, so this gets us to a point. We built out our list of those things to build. We created them all in the game, so that was kind of the MVP content generation piece. And at this point, we achieved MVP. Our state space has good coverage, and we're confident in it. We know we've spoken to all of the clocks. We've spoken to all of the different kinds of essential story we need to talk about. We've spoken to all of the big things that the players have had agency to vary up to this point. And so we're confident that when they come in and play this content, they're going to be seeing elements that speak to what choices they made up to this point, in many cases when they really did not expect that to be the case. So feedback that we got from players was, I was expecting that you were going to throw away and never speak to a lot of the choices that I made coming up to the city because I didn't know how you could possibly do that. And in fact, we did manage to speak to a lot of that. So now we're at a good place to iterate. And a lot of projects that work with storylets, you get to an iteration state before you've actually sort of covered your state space adequately because you haven't analyzed your state space adequately, and that can get quite messy. But if you're at this place where you're sort of like, I already have essential content for all of this, then when you're iterating, you can focus on the dynamic experience of playing with this. So do we have a space that not only is fully populated with content, but also is narratively satisfying to traverse? Are there big swings that we can make in terms of what's going on in this story that feel good from a story perspective? Are there incremental changes available, and do they take the right amount of time? So it's not too long, not too little. So in this, for instance, we did allow, after the city was already built, the player to invest in different kind of ideological alignments and advance towards sort of changes of ideology, but it took time, it took resources, it took energy to make that happen, and we wanted to make sure that the amount of time was satisfying. It didn't feel like they were trivially changing something essential about the NPCs in the city, but they were still able to unlock cool stuff. So that kind of approach of periodically redoing the choice that they'd had at the beginning. You've moved the ideology of the city along, and now you have the option again to say, no, actually I've decided that this city, now that I've changed it up a bit, I've eliminated all members of this faction, I've supported that faction, we're now going to change the way the city understands itself. And then the sort of big swings point is how often do we get to sort of set the city as a whole on fire? There are some options available when you've sort of spent enough time there, built up enough resources, that you might want to be able to cause something catastrophic to happen. And one of the things that we worked on in iteration was making sure that we were applying appropriate resource costs and consequences to those moments as well. Because one of the things that we wanted to enable was a situation where the player builds up their resources and then actually betrays the city to a competing faction or ideology, which is a fun moment to have one time in gameplay. But if the player is doing it over and over and over again, that has kind of a different implication. They're coming off as a bit more treacherous and unpleasant to the city. So this was the point, in the iteration stage, was the point where we were working out. We want to let the player do that for a certain resource cost at a certain point, but then once they've done it, it should cost so much that doing it repeatedly is a real decision. It's not just kind of something you do mildly. And then in this iteration process, this was also the point where we noticed or paid more attention to where are there precarious world states that if the player brings those about, we should have some sort of special thing fire off. So if you've got an ideology for your whole city where everybody's aligned behind a particular perspective, but you've got a leader installed in that city who has an opposing ideology, that's a situation that is kind of inherently to the narrative precarious. It's something that should kick something off, even though we're not asking the player to invest resources in making something exciting happen, something interesting should result nonetheless, and so we attached storylets to that. So that got us to the point where after we had been through that kind of iteration phase, we had not only the state space coverage that we wanted, but also the sort of emergent dynamics that we wanted as well, which is often the point where games that are using this kind of approach don't necessarily have time to kind of refine that piece as much as they would like. And then we dug into kind of the real polish elements, like just extra nuanced, cute things, rare events that kick off in special circumstances, more QA, and just extra sort of text embellishments. But it's lovely to be able to get to a point where you can have all of those nice to haves. That is how we applied our approach to that project, and I will stop there.
Okay, we have time for some questions. Back.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned a lot of really cool techniques. I imagine that if you start combining a lot of these, you sort of end up with this exponentially growing amount of narrative permutations. Do you have any particular systems that you use to keep track of how these sort of branching paths result in maybe different pieces of content that you would need to create in order to make those feel responsive? And I guess as a follow-up question, do you feel like there's a risk that maybe certain players can go down a path where content there's less content created reactively, and might feel like the game is less responsive than another player who might go down a path where there's gone a lot of work into?
Yes, I mean, obviously, so that is, so the question is, how do we sort of account for what needs coverage and sort of making sure that we understand all of that combination? A lot of what I'm describing here of just like, let's understand what are all of the possible states important to the story that the player can even get into, is trying to sort of address that question from the outset, right? Like, let's make sure that we know what are all of the ideological combinations that somebody can get into. Let's say, make sure that we have a concrete, complete list of all of the sort of comparative places that the menace clocks can get into, so that we know from the outset, as a matter of combination, what those are. And then it's true that there can be places where there's a kind of an unexpected influence between two states that we haven't really sort of thought about how they compare. But a lot of the kind of planning at the outset around, specifically how do these stats affect one part of the storytelling and these stats affect another part of the storytelling, helps us get to that sort of initial understanding. So that was a lot of kind of what I'm getting to with the planning phase of this. Then in terms of just calculating how much is out there, sometimes using techniques like those text variables give us an opportunity to create a bunch of combination that's relatively cheap. So because you're not saying I'm building an entire separate storylet for each of these situations, I'm instead sort of really customizing a specific storylet. That again gets us away from some of the sort of challenges of the amount of combination that would otherwise be necessary. Does that make sense? Cool.
Hello, over here.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a confession to make. I've always been on the producer archetype when it comes to these systems, but mainly not because the writers cannot handle it, but it was always about testing in QA of this, especially in games where the writer is removed from the actual integration of the scenes. Do you do some sort of validation, or what is the approach of like handling testing all the permutations? Because I can imagine that's quite hard.
Yeah, so I haven't. I left that out of this talk entirely because I was trying to focus on like the scope planning side of it. But So there are a bunch of different approaches that I've developed around, partly around, like, can we in fact keep the writers involved in the actual implementation as much as possible? Like, as you say, it's very helpful if you have a system where they can be a bit hands-on rather than having somebody else needing to interpret for them. So things that reduce the friction for the writers to actually be engaged in engine and the friction for them to test their own work immediately on creating it, like that helps a lot if you can do that. And I know not all pipelines allow that. Then other things that are useful are having an automated testing setup that allows you to run through specifically the narrative elements of the game. You might not bother to simulate all of the other aspects of gameplay if you're hooking this together with some larger game system. You might be sort of automatically or randomly generating what the inputs from that system would be. But I've worked on a number of projects where we had an automated testing tool for the narrative content specifically that then allowed us to run through a lot of either randomized or what's actually even more useful are examples where you're starting the game with players with specific prefab profiles, so you can actually emulate, you know, real world type situations that they could be in and then follow what comes out of that. And then in the testing structure, you want that testing structure to output logs, you want it to output analytics about any places where things got stuck, any repetitions that you think shouldn't be showing up in the narrative. Something that I worked on a different project at Fail Better was a project where we actually were able to run the automated test and put asserts into the content that would say this content should only appear, you know, in the following circumstances with the following sort of parameters. In case if that's not true, we're going to kick up an error in the automated testing. And that was also super useful. And the engineer on that project is giving a talk specifically about the testing tools at Develop in the UK this year. So anybody who's interested in that should check that out.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. That was a lovely talk.